Okay, good morning. Today's Daf Yomi is Chagigah Daf Yud Aleph, Chagigah 11. We're going to start around 10 lines down on 11a we're talking about the Mishnah. It said that there were certain things that were floating in the air, that was the laws of vows, and there were other laws that were mountains hanging by a thread. Those were the laws of Shabbos, for example, and the laws of Me'ilah, misappropriation of temple property. And now there are other laws, now the Talmudim tell us, that were Mikra Muat, very few verses, V'halachos Merubos, but there are many laws associated with them, even though there are very few verses. What are these laws? So the Gemara says, Tana, we have a Brisa, that Brisa teaches us the following. Negayim Ve'olos. Negayim refers to the laws of Tsaras, the laws of what we call, and translated colloquially as leprosy, and Olos, those are the laws of if a body is in a room with an enclosure over it, that's called a tent, that will basically be what's called Olal Ames, so that everything inside that enclosure is going to be considered ritually impure, and also the enclosure stops the tumah from penetrating higher. All of these laws are mikra muat, very few verses, v'halachos merubos, and many laws associated with it. So the Gemara asks the question about this. What do you mean? How could we say that? Negayim mikra merubahu. There are many verses associated with the laws of tzaras. There's parashos, and there's two parashos that are basically associated with it. Tazria Mitzorah. So what do you mean that these are very few verses? There are many verses. Amar Papa Hachikamar. So Papa says this is what we mean to say. Negayim, that the laws of tzaras are as follows. Negayim mikra meruba v'halachos muatos. This is how we read it. That the laws of tzaras are many verses, but there are very few laws. Whereas the laws of Olal Ames, the laws of ritual impurity in the tent, those are mikra muat. Those are very few verses, v'halachos merubos, but there are many halachos. So the Gemara says, "Umay nafkamina." Why are you telling us this? Like, what's the difference for us? The Gemara tells us. I'll tell you why. You mistabcha milsa benegayim. If you have a question about saras, you don't know what to do, ayin bikra. You could just refer to the verses, and there you could be able to derive the halachos straight from the verses. Whereas but if you're not sure about the laws as they relate to laws of impurity emanating from a dead body in an enclosure, ayin b'masnisin. Then you can't look at the verses. Then what you have to do is you have to look at the oral law, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Brisos to understand the laws. The next topic was dinin. Dinin are the laws of civil laws of how we owe somebody money, etc. So the Gemara says miltav k'tivin. What do you mean that these are? How can we say that how can the Mishnah say they're not explicit in the Torah, but yesh mamashi yismochu? They have what to rely upon. What do you mean they have what to rely upon? It's explicit. We have mishpatim, parshas mishpatim. It's all there. What does the Mishnah say? They're only what to rely upon. They're explicit. So the Gemara says, "Lo nitzracha ella." We need it for the following teaching. Our Mishnah is teaching us that those. What are we referring to? Look at Rebbe, the laws that Rebbe taught. That those laws were not explicit, but they have what to rely upon. In Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, because it says in the Exodus chapter 21 that if two men are fighting, v'nagfu isha hara, and they strike a woman, v'yatsu yoadeha v'lo ya'ason, and they strike her, and she is not killed, but the baby she was carrying is miscarried. Then we say, the verse says, "Anoshi anesh kasher yashis alav bala ishav nasam beplilim." So this verse is referring to a person who intended to strike his friend, and accidentally he struck a pregnant woman. That if the woman doesn't die, what happens is she has this miscarriage, he has to pay the value of the fetus. However, if the woman will die, then the verse states, "Nasat nefesh tachas nefesh." And about that Brisa, Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says, Rebbe says about that brisa, Rebbe says, when it says nefesh tachas nefesh, what does it mean? It means mammon. It means he has to pay the money. So this is not explicit, but it has what to rely upon. So the Gemara says, Rebbe explains, or the Gemara explains what Rebbe was saying. Atomer mamono eno el nefesh mamish. Maybe if he strikes the woman and causes the baby to abort, maybe he has to actually, maybe he's liable for death. Maybe he's liable not for money, but for death. Gemara says, no, Rebbe would say that's not the case, because Nemer Nesino Amata and Nemer Nesino Amala. It says the word tachas, it says Venasata Nefesh, tachas Nefesh, the word Nesina, which is you'll place, and Venemer Nesina Lamala. And it also says here in this case, Vinasam Biflilim. So we have the same word Vinasan for Vinasata. Mala Alan Mamon, just like by Nefesh, tachas Nefesh. But by an eye for an eye, a soul for a soul, an eye for an eye, it doesn't really mean life in those cases, but where you steal, it implies an eye for an eye is a monetary damage. Afkan, so to here also is mammon, it's a monetary damage. And so therefore, this teaching of Rebbe is not explicit in the Torah, but it is based upon the verses. And the Mishnah had taught us that avodos, that the laws of sacrificing the sacrificial offerings are not in the Torah, but they have on what to rely upon. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? The laws of the sacrifices, of course, they're written in the Torah. We're almost up to Sefer Vayikra. It's all the laws of the sacrifices are there. The Gemara says, no, what we're referring to is that there are four essential parts to the sacrifices. There's Shlita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika, the slaughtering of the animal, the Kabbalah, the gathering of the blood, and the Holacha, the carrying of the blood, and the Zrika, the sprinkling of the blood. And even though these are four essential aspects, meaning say if you have an improper thought, Rashi tells us during any one of these aspects, you'll disqualify the slaughter. The Gemara in Tzvachim tells us that you could actually do a kosher service without doing this conveying of the blood, by doing the slaughter and receiving the blood right next to the altar. So that's the background. In this context, the Gemara says, so what does it mean that the sacrifices have what to rely upon? It refers to the conveying of the blood. After the Kohen receives the blood, he has to convey it to the altar. So that we're saying that is not explicit. That's not explicit because the Torah says, we learned in the Bryce, it says that you shall slaughter the animal. You shall literally carry the sons of Aaron shall carry the blood and sprinkle the blood on the altar. But the Talmud says in that Bryce, we're saying actually that since it says v'ikrivu and then it says v'shachat, it says v'ikrivu b'nei Aaron v'zarkos adam al mizbeach, and it says v'shachat and then it says v'ikrivu, and so it can't mean that you go from slaughtering it and straight to conveying it because you're skipping a step. So what step are you skipping? The receiving of the blood, the kabbalah sadam, the collecting of the blood, and so therefore it's the verse is teaching us that the receiving of the blood is an essential part of the service and it needs to be done by the Kohen. So why does the Torah refer to the receiving of the blood using a terminology of conveying? Because with respect to the sacrifices, it states the Kohen shall bring everything and he shall burn it on the altar. That when it says v'ikriv, this is referring to the carrying of the limbs to the ramp. And so therefore, since in this verse, the hakrava refers to halacha, therefore also in the other verse that we said above, the hakrava refers to halacha. And so therefore, why does it say the receiving of the blood using an expression of halacha? To teach us this idea that halacha, the conveying of the blood, is the same status as receiving of the blood. That just like when you receive the blood, you could disqualify a slaughter, so too when you convey the blood, you can disqualify a slaughter. And so that's what our Mishnah says, what these laws are not explicit, but we have what to rely upon because it never actually states the receiving of the blood in the Talmud. Okay, so now we're to the next part of the Mishnah, the laws of taharos. So the laws of how a person becomes ritually purified. So these laws, we know that after a person becomes tamei, if either a woman who wants to become ritually pure to be with her husband, or a person who wants to become tamei to eat from the sacred food or enter into the temple, it says as follows. It says v'taros. So the Talmud says michtav tivan. We know that you have to go to the mikvah. These are laws that are written in the Torah. Actually, where is it written in the Torah? Where is it written in the Torah that you have to immerse in a mikvah? So that's a question that the commentaries discuss. But anyway, we'll leave that for now because the Talmud says lo nitzracha el shir mikvah. So what's the amount that's not written explicitly, but what has what to rely upon? That's the size of the mikvah. How big does a mikvah have to be? The lo ksiva, that's not actually anywhere written. The Tanya, because we learned in the verse virachatz that a person should virachatz. It says virachatz b'mayim esol b'saro. He shall wash himself in the water, all of his flesh, which means b'mei mikvah. Virachatz b'mayim means he has to wash himself in a mikvah. As kol b'saro, all of his flesh. What does that mean? That means that he has to wash shakol gufo oleban, mayim shakol gufo oleban, water that his entire body should immerse in it. Bekamahin, what's enough amount of the size of water that his whole body is capable to immerse in it? Ama or ama barum shalosh amos, which is 1 ama by 1 ama with a height of 3 amos. Vishiru chachamim, and the sages established mikvah arba'im, and the sages established that this is 40 sa. So that's the size of our mikvah today, which is 40 sa. And we learn it from here. No, it's not explicit. It's based upon this concept from the Talmud. And then it states tameos, the laws of Tumah are not explicit in Torah, but we have what to rely upon. What do you mean the laws of Tumah? If a person touches something that they're not supposed to touch, they become ritually impure. So what is this a reference to? Michtav K'tivan, aren't they written? So the Gemara says no. How do you become tamei? If you touch a part of a dead animal that was the size of a lentil. This is the sheretz, the shmona shratzim of these 8 types of animals. If you touch a lentil size amount from it, the lo ksiva, it's not actually explicitly written in the Torah, the Tanya, because it says in the verse. Bahem, it says in the verse in Ela Tmeim Lachem B'chol Asheretz Kol Anogea Bahem. Whoever touches them, Yachol B'Kulan. I might think if you touch all of them, Talmud Omer Mayhem, a part of them. Yachol B'Mitzvahs, and I might think if you just touch any part, Talmud Bahem. No, you have to touch them. Okay, Tzad Ad Sheyagia B'Mitzvahs Oshu Kukul, until you touch a part of it, which is equivalent to all of it, which is how much? And Shiru Chachamim B'Kadasha. And the sages established that this is a size of a lentil. Shekain chomet tchilaso b'kadasha. A chomet, and Rashi says, I say, this is always, you see this a couple of times in the commentary in Rashi's commentary, he uses this expression. He wants to make clear that this is his own explanation. He's not basing it off of a source. Rashi says that this is a type of animal that's called a limga in French, or he says it's a snail. Basically, it grows inside its shell, and always the shell wraps around them. So he says the beginning of this shell is the size of a lentil, and so Rashi therefore says that what we're talking about here is that that's the minimum amount because that's shekain chomet chilaso b'kadasha. When a snail starts, it's the size of a lentil. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says kizanav hal ta'al, like the tail of a lizard, because this tail will continue to move after it's cut, and that's why it says a portion of it miktsasa shekukul sheyesh bo chiyas. It has like life to it because it can move around and thrash even after it's cut off. And then we said also arayos, the laws of sexual sins are also, they have what to rely upon. So Gemara says michtav ketivan. These are written explicitly in the Torah. So the Talmud says lo nitzracha. No, when is this a reference to? Lebito me'anusaso. If Rahman al-Islam, a person does something terrible and he assaults a woman and he has a child from her, we might have thought that since he wasn't married to her, since he did this against her will, that therefore the laws of prohibited relationships wouldn't apply to that daughter. The Talmud tells us that even though it's not written in the Torah to look siva, even though it's not written explicitly in the Torah, it has what to rely upon. How so? The Amarava, Amarli, Rabbi Yitzchak, Paravdimi, Asya, Hena, Asya, Zima, Zima. We make a Gzera Shava. Rashi goes into it in depth, and that's how we know we can compare that even though the laws of such a daughter or father are not explicit in the Torah, the same laws apply. And then the Talmud says, the Mishnah says, Hein Gufei Torah. These are the essential aspects of the Torah. So the Gemara says, these, and that's it. Hani in Hanacho, meaning to say these things that the Mishnah discussed, they are the essential aspects of the Torah, but those that are not, they're not the essential aspects of the Torah. Meaning the first part of the Mishnah, that they just have a few verses about them, they're not the essential part of the Torah. Nor says Ela Ema Hein Gufei Torah. These are also included in as part of the essential aspects of the Torah. Okay, we've completed the first chapter, and now we go on to the second chapter. However, I just want to say that the Tiferes Yisrael points out that the first Mishnah of the second chapter is actually should really be included in the first chapter, because we just talked about how the laws of sexual sin of a daughter who came from a forced relationship is a sexual sin. Therefore, the Talmud then goes on to talking about how we can discuss sexual sins. But this next Mishnah, which really should be the last Mishnah of the first chapter, it ends that with the words about a certain person, it would be better off he would never have been created. And the Talmud never wants to end a chapter in that note, on a bad note. So therefore, it makes this next Mishnah the first Mishnah of the next chapter, even though thematically it should really have been in chapter 1. This next chapter is one of the most glorious chapters in the entire Talmud. It talks about all the things we're not supposed to talk about, and it goes into it in detail. It talks about Kabbalah, it talks about heretics, all the things that you get in trouble for studying, and then we're not supposed to talk about. So the Talmud's telling us we should be careful about how we discuss it. We have to do it with great discretion. So that's the first part of the mission. Then the second Mishnah onward discusses the laws of the Chagigah, and then it discusses the laws of the classic cases in the Babylonian Talmud of the laws of ritual purity and impurity, which many of us, our head spins about it because the Talmud always cites from it, but never gives us like a clear discussion. So this is the clearest discussion in the entire Talmud. Will come at the conclusion of this chapter. So the Talmud says, "Ein Darshan." We do not expound. That's the title of this chapter. Ein Darshan. You're not allowed to give a drush. You're not allowed to teach be'arayos b'shlosha. You're not allowed to teach about the laws of sexual sins with 3 people. And the assumption of the Mishnah of the Talmud at first is that means this is 1 plus the 2 1 teacher plus 2 students that you're not allowed to do. And you're not allowed to discuss the story of creation with 2 people. Excuse me. Again, Rashi is telling us that the assumption is with the teacher and 1 person. The Merkava refers to the prophecy of Ezekiel in chapter 1 and chapter 10 of Ezekiel, where he has this celestial vision of a chariot with the 4 faces on the throne of God. And that you're not allowed to even discuss with 1 person, unless he was a scholar and he could understand on his own. Now the Talmud tells us whoever looks at 4 things, rasoilo, the word rasoi is really another way of saying roilo, it's appropriate, fitting. If a person thinks too much about 4 things, better off that it should not have been created. What are these 4 things? Malamala, malamata, malafnim, malachor. What's above, what's below, what's in front, and what's behind. So there's a couple of disputes. There's a major dispute. What does this mean even? So most Rashi understands this to mean, what does it mean? What's above the heavens and what's below below the heavens, what's inside the partition of the heavens, and what's to the back of the heavens. However, in the printed Rashi, it then quotes Tosfos, and Tosfos, which is obviously unusual because Tosfos is Rashi's. Some of them were Rashi's grandchildren, but they were 1 or 2 generations or 3 generations after Rashi. So they inserted this into the Rashi's text. And they say the following: Eino yachol liot ma shepiresh hamora. It cannot be that the way our teacher explains it, that means inside the heavens or behind the heavens, because the Talmud goes into it, and they have a question from the Talmud. So it means when it says, therefore, what it means is lifnim mada. It refers to kodem olam, what happened prior to the creation of the world. Don't think about that. Better that you've not been created, and basically what's behind what will be there after we die. So that's the implication, that they're referring to different, trying to know what happened before we were created and what happened after we were created.
Rabbi, can I ask a question? I don't take your time, but I have an astrophysicist, emeritus professor. When I asked him what came before the Big Bang, he said, "Don't ask me. I have no way."
Okay, there you go.
So that's correct? Don't ask me.
Well, that's according to the second approach. Don't ask what happened prior.
Send this to him. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Talmud says, Amr is Bereisha. You said at the clause, amongst those things that you're not allowed to discuss in public, it says you're not allowed to discuss the chariot theory, the theory of what happened to Ezekiel's chariot. You're not allowed to discuss that even by yourself. And so certainly we're talking about somebody here who is wise and understands, because how else could he learn it by itself? And then you said, unless he's wise. So what is it? So the Talmud says, okay, we were misunderstanding it. This is how we understand it. Meaning to say, you don't teach the laws of sexual sins to 3 students aside from the Rebbe. And you don't teach the laws of the creation of the world with Shnayim, to 2 people aside from the Rebbe. And you don't teach the story of the celestial chariot to even a single individual, unless this person is so wise and he understands on his own. By the way, this is the closest we're going to get in the whole Talmud this next few days to Kabbalah, to this mystical and the study of it. So this is the closest to it, and it seems to be saying you're supposed to teach that in a very discrete setting, not in like large classes. Okay, ein dorshin ba'arayos b'shlosha. You don't expound the laws of arayos with a group of 3. My time. What's the reasoning? If you want to say because the verse states in the passage of arayos in Parshas Achrimos, ish al kol she'er b'saro. Every person to the naked flesh he shall not come close, and ish means trey. That means that those 2 people share b'saro chad. So that means that means you can't teach it to more than 3. Meaning to say you can only teach it to 2 students and not to more than that. So the Talmud says, and then it says you're not allowed to teach to expose a nakedness. So if that's the case, that's how we get 3. What about the fact that the verse says, if a person curses God, and he bears a sin, well, there too, both of those cases, somebody who passes their son into Moach, would you say, they need 2 people to do the sin at once? Obviously not. Elahanu, when does it say ish? That's written in the verse. When it says ish with respect to cursing God and passing a child through Moach, it refers to non-Jews who are just as obligated in the prohibition not to curse God or to pass their or to worship idolatry. So this is teaching us why it says ish here, ish. This double expression is to teach us that just like Jewish people are commanded not to commit sexual sins, so too those who are not of the Jewish faith are commanded not to violate sexual sins. So the Gemara says there's another verse that discusses this. The end of that chapter, it says, "You shall guard my commandments." Ushmartem is trey, mishmarti is chad. That implies one, and so that's three. And the verse states, the Torah states that you should not teach the laws of arayos in front of three. Does that mean also all those laws, the Shabbos and the Matzos, that you're also not allowed to teach to three? What does it mean you can't teach the arayos to three? So there's different ways to read this. We'll first give the main explanation, then we'll say a different one. So it means ein dorshim b'sitzrei arayos. You're not supposed to teach those laws of arayos that are not explicitly written in the Torah l'shlosha to three. My time svarahu, because it's logical. Because beitrei, two students, ki asvi kame rabbayu, two students when they sit in front of their teacher, chad shakavatari bahade rabbi, v'idach matzli unel gemara. If they have two students sitting in front, then one will argue back and forth with the teacher to sharpen everybody's minds, and the other one will write down the notes and have exactly what the teacher says. But if you have three students, one is arguing with the teacher, and the other two students will start talking to each other. And in the end, they won't know what the Rebbe says. And next thing you know, they're going to mess things up, and they're going to say something that's permitted is prohibited. So therefore, don't discuss it in front of three, only in front of two. Others say no. What do you mean that if it's that the laws of arayos that are hidden in the Torah you're not supposed to discuss? Well, then how's anybody gonna know what to do? So some say this refers to there are certain leniencies with respect to sexual sins that are not broadcast, but they're out there for the scholars to know under special circumstances when to apply them. So those things you have to only teach in very, very discreet setting. So the Gemara says, so the whole Torah also you shouldn't teach in that setting. This goes really to the first explanation. So arayos shani, no arayos, the sexual sins are different. The Amar Mar, gezel v'arayos, nafsho mechamad detanu metavelahem. Because when it comes to theft and sexual sins, your soul is always desiring them. And so therefore, you have to be careful how you teach it. You can't teach it in front of three people. Well, the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, gezel nami. Well, by theft also, you should be careful not to teach it in front of three. The Gemara says, arayos, no, the sexual sins, bein b'fanav, bein shelo b'fanav. The person's sex has to be on guard against sexual sins, whether or not a person is right, being tempted, nefesh yitzrei. His soul is always going to be tempting him. But gezel b'fanav, if the person sees something in front of him, he might steal it, but not nefesh yatzrei. Shelo b'fanav, if he's not in front of him, lo nefesh yatzrei, then his soul is not going to pull him to stealing in that context. So so you have to be even greater on guard for sexual sins than for the sin of theft. Sexual sin is, even if it's not right in front of your eyes, you could still be Rahman tempted. That you're not allowed to even teach the story of the creation to two people. What's the source for this idea? The Gemara says the Tan Rabbanan, because it says in the verse, Ki sha'alna yamim rishonim, because it says when you ask yamim rishonim, and yachid shoel ve'in shnayim shoelim. So from the fact that it says sha'alna, which is in the singular, when he asks you about the earlier days, that only one person can ask and two people should not ask. Yachol yishal adam. I might have thought that one person is allowed to ask what happened prior to the creation of the world. That's only from the time where from the day of the creation of the world, that's only when he could ask. I might think he can't ask about the 6 days of creation. Meaning to say that for the first day of creation he can ask, but prior to that he can't. We'll stop here. God willing, we'll pick this up on tonight and also tomorrow morning. We'll repeat it tomorrow. I want to say is the same